very excited and very privileged to have Dr. Sabina Alkire. Dr. Alkire directs the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, which is a research center within the Oxford Department of International Development. Dr. Alkire has previously worked at the George Washington University, Harvard, the Human Security Commission, and the World Bank. And together with Professor James Foster, Dr. Alkire developed a flexible method for measuring multi-dimensional poverty that can incorporate different dimensions or aspects of poverty or well-being. Now, this method has been applied empirically, which I think is really important to produce a global multidimensional poverty index, as well as dozens of bespoke MPIs used as official national statistics. Dr. Alkire has also been privileged in that the royal government of Bhutan uses an adaptation of this methodology for their gross national happiness index, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. And this is really our opportunity to learn a little more about GNHI. I mean, I've been personally, I've been a big fan of the index, and really looking forward to today's discussion. So over to you, Dr. Alkire.
Thank you so much. And it's really a joy to be here. And I look forward very much to our discussion. I've tried to share my slides, and we'll see if when they come. But a couple years ago, there was a film that was nominated at the Palme d'Or, the prize in Cannes, and it had a strangely fetching title of Bread and Roses. Can you see my slides?
We can. We surely can. Are you able to see it?
I can see a thumbnail. Yes, it's fine. Fine for me.
Yeah. Okay. We can see the slides.
Very good. So it had a fetching title of Bread and Roses, and it derives from a poem from James Oppenheimer about a labor strike in 1912, in which female textile workers were deeply disgruntled. But the women's concerns and demands extended beyond just their wages. Poem says, "Our lives shall not be sweated from birth until life closes. Hearts starve as well as bodies," the workers observe. "So give us bread, but give us roses." The demand for roses too, not merely for survival, but for beauty, fondness, fragrance, seems as perennial as it is elusive. But it is this amplitude of aims and tastes that underlies a deep reappreciation of well-being as an appropriate and feasible aim, alongside SDGs focused on poverty in many dimensions, on very practical things like partnership with people and planet. And so today we want to create space for each of us to reflect on what it means to create connected societies and to advance the well-being of people and planet. And in a sense, during this time of the pandemic, it's been a lovely chance to reassess one's own well-being. All of us have had to work harder in order to have a healthy lifestyle. And in the social media and in the corporate world, recognition of mental health, of exercise, of mindfulness, of the importance of friendship and the dangers of loneliness and isolation have come up very strongly. And so no longer, in a sense, can we only focus on bread, on the material aspects of life, but we also need to think about the roses, to think about the other parts of our colleagues' lives, of our customers' lives, of lives in the communities and surrounds. So very briefly, I'm going to share with you some definitions of well-being that have come up, different ways, and people have tried to put structure on this very elusive concept where everybody is so different. How could we have a common measure? How could we have a set of things we care about in our CSR or in our corporate work? And then we'll also think about conceptual bases of these. We'll think about an example, for example, in Bhutan and their gross national happiness index. And then we will end with a little bit of a survey exercise. So coming to well-being, it's been defined in many and various ways. And one platform which has been thinking about well-being are the Human Development Reports, which were launched in 1990 with the leadership of Amartya Sen, Mahbub al-Haq, and a group of people coming out of capability approach, basic needs, recognizing a need for a wider understanding. And they articulated human development, as opposed to economic development, as being an expansion of people's freedoms to live long, healthy, and creative lives, and to advance other things that they care about, and to actively shape development as agents, as protagonists, and not just as passive victims of cunning policies. And so people were the beneficiaries. Development has to be about people. The aim is not economic growth, but economic growth has to be a means to people's flourishing, to their well-being. And that's not, of course, the only statement. And there has been a great deal of interest going forward. In 2009, very famously, President Sarkozy in France developed a commission on well-being and said that the GDP is not reflecting what we care about. And so we do need better metrics. And one of the groups in it was a group focused on quality of life. And they argued that across different countries, across different times and cultures, these 8 dimensions of quality of life should be considered simultaneously, because any one of them at any point in somebody's life might be the most important. If you've lost your job, if you don't know where the rent is coming from, then material living standards leap to the top of your list. If you've had a health challenge and you're just in recovery, then health is the number one. If it's the night before an exam, then education is number one. If you're looking for a work that truly fulfills your potential, your ability to give and act, then work comes to the top. So any of these, political voice, relationships, environment, and psychological well-being, all of them can be most important at any given time. So that's one potential framework of well-being. I don't know what you think of that. I'm going to show you 3 more, and later on we'll ask you to share some of yours. Another study that actually was before this one was in the early 2000s, 1999, 2000, by the World Bank, where they went to many communities and they said, who among you are disadvantaged? And they used whatever respectful word it was to refer to those communities. And then they would gather them and say, do you consider yourselves to be somehow experiencing ill-being? And if the people said yes, then they said, well, what is it? But they also said, what is well-being for you? And so this was looking through the eyes of people who self-identified as poor, but asking them, what is fulfillment? What is flourishing? And it was interesting because clearly material well-being came up, health came up, but also relationships, family, being able to look after the kids, but also security. It came up very strongly, security from violence. But psychological well-being came up very strongly in the voices of the poor, as did freedom of choice and action. So these are another way of thinking about well-being, listening to different groups in the society. But it's not so very different from the quote-unquote economic experts in the other. And many governments have had then exercises about discussing what well-being is. For example, back a decade ago in 2010, David Cameron said that the UK should measure our progress not just by how our economy is growing, but how our lives are improving, not by our standard of living, but our quality of life. And they had a lot of consultations across the country, and they came up with 10 domains that reflect well-being. And these include subjective well-being, which they call personal well-being, which is happiness, positive emotions like joy and compassion, and negative emotions like jealousy or sadness. It includes our relationships, both the intimate ones in families and the societal ones. It includes the health, the education, but also, in a sense, the structures outside of us, which are broadly called governance, environment, what we do. That includes work, but for retired people, their activities, for people who have caring responsibilities, their care duties, where we live, our local environment, our safety, the lack of pollution, personal finance and economy. And recently in the academic literature, just so that you know, in case you haven't had time to read 900 pages, there's been a lot of interest. So you've all heard of the International Panel for Climate Change. But building on that legacy, in Princeton University, they set up the International Panel for Social Progress, led by Mark Fleurbe. It sounds like a joke. It brought together 260 academics. And initially they wrote 2,000 pages and distilled them to 900 pages in 3 volumes. And they also covered different dimensions of well-being and asked, how should we measure them? How should we advance them? What kind of values do we need in order that we care for each other and in order that we have balanced lives in terms of our activities and do feel fulfilled? These were crystallized into a paperback, a manifesto for social progress, which gives, in a sense, the policy reading of that study. And there's more. It's 10 years since the first study that I mentioned. And so OECD came up with another study, building on it, deepening it. And they've now set up a center called WISE in the OECD to look at well-being. So the first question when we start to talk about well-being and when we start to imagine how we in our workplace appropriately and professionally could do activities that give others the space to flourish, recognizing that the dimensions of flourishing are wider than just the wages, wider than just bread, but they include roses too, then these kinds of exercises can be important because they give you a shorthand, a quick list that you can improve upon. But what you can see reading across them is that they're not terribly different. All of them have health, all of them have education, some have time use, some don't. All of them have economic conditions, environment, and psychological well-being. Of course, how they define them and how specific they are differ. But this, when we talk about well-being and when we think about our responsibilities, it can be useful for a moment just to go back to these definitions. So I didn't want to bore you to death, but I wanted to give you this slide as a shorthand, as a way of distilling a lot of work by hundreds of people to think about what well-being will mean in this context, in the context of the SDGs you've chosen and the activities that are run. But also, all of us are professionals and we are people. And so it also might help in our own lives to think these things through. As a social scientist, I never inflict on anybody a survey or an idea I haven't first inflicted upon myself to make sure that it works for me with dignity and respect. And an interesting area I just wanted to footnote, which was coming up before the pandemic and has increased during it, has been the recognition that this well-being isn't something for after hours. It's not something to put on hold while we come to the office and have our meetings on Zoom and on different platform. But actually, one can bring this recognition of the importance of well-being, happiness, flourishing into the workplace and think about how organizations can support our colleagues so that the workplace also becomes a place where we blossom and can both have institutions that do good, but also are institutions where people are healthy in many different dimensions. For example, this inner MBA program that Tammy Simon and the Sounds True community run with a number of the leading B Corp corporations with a number of other leaders teaches private sector leaders not just to get the inner MBA in terms of organizing people, but in terms of the emotions, the mindfulness, the inner qualities to bring to management and leadership. And that is very important in times where external stresses have increased the anxieties and the stresses that leaders face. So that's just a short list, a slide to come back to with lists for those who like lists, and a poem for those who don't. You might want to go back and read that poem on bread and roses. I wanted to mention one other aspect, which I think is articulated best by the capability approach developed by Amartya Sen, and it is the fact that even if we have a list, it's not never frozen in time, because well-being is always creative and imagined, and part of the freedom of choice and action that was articulated by the Voices of the Poor is our agency to continually create and recreate what well-being means for us as people and in communities. So this draws on a literature from Professor Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate in economics from 1998, who is still teaching in Harvard and earlier was in Trinity College, Cambridge, and in the Delhi School in Kolkata, in London School of Economics, and in Oxford. And his most recent book is an autobiography that came out in July of this year, but there's been quite a lot of his work which focused on the philosophical development of well-being in a way that is appropriate for social science action. And so basically what he said is that instead of focusing on what Aristotle referred to as wealth, which is quote unquote merely useful and that for the sake of something else, that's the words of Aristotle, one might want to focus on people's capabilities. That might be the best way to talk about well-being. And their capabilities will always be multidimensional, because they will cover these different aspects. But they also have to relate to the person's values. A hermit might not value parties. An artist might not value mathematics. And so there's inevitably a diversity of definitions of legitimate well-being. And so because of that, you cannot define well-being by a list and make everybody fit into that box. It has to have an aspect of freedom and creativity. And so, first of all, he defines two aspects of freedom. One is that well-being is good by giving people a menu of which they will choose one aspect. Because if I was going to read tonight a novel, and I've been traveling, I'm tired, I'd just like a night in, I stay at home and read my novel. But if tonight there's a curfew in Oxford and I'm not permitted to go out, I'm not permitted to go to a party, to go see a friend, to do anything, and I'm in curfew, then I might read my novel. But something important has been missed. My freedom, the different things I could do, have been taken away. And so he says that's important, to have options. And the other is agency, to be authentically able to shape your own destiny and that of communities that you care about, whether that's human communities or the environment, or art and music and other forms of expression. So it's important when we think of lists to recognize the lists are only sort of a shape, but we need creativity and freedom to tailor them to individual lives. So how does this work in practice? I'm going to give you one example, and then we will also move and have some interactions to hear about your inputs and your experiences and how this might be more relevant. What you've noticed is missing from what has been presented, or might be important and you'd like to talk a little bit more about. But as you will know, in the 1970s, 1980s, Bhutan was animated by an insight that His Majesty the Fourth King had, which he articulated as saying that gross national happiness is more important than gross national product. But by happiness, he didn't mean a Western idea of happiness that's individual and selfish. One of the sadness about the World Happiness Report is that the countries that quote unquote are happiest are destroying the planet and might not have the best relationships. In Bhutan, happiness in their own language, Gaki, is a multidimensional concept, and it means flourishing of the community and the planet, and very much the environment is part of their worldview. So just to share one idea of what they are doing, they identify 9 domains of gross national happiness. And these are very similar to the others. Health, education, living standards, which includes income and housing, is there. Governance and time use and environment is there. Community, and which includes relationships, both of family and wider community, is there. Safety. But there's also cultural diversity and resilience, which includes art, courtesy, holidays, languages. And there's also psychological well-being, which here not only includes the positive, negative emotions, but also spirituality, consideration of your destiny or karma, and life satisfaction with your quality of life. In that case, what they do, just to explain measurement in a slide, is that every person answers a question on each of these 33 indicators, and they get a score of going from 0 to 100% of the percentage of weighted indicators in which they have sufficiency. Now, sufficiency is an important term because they're not saying that any government policy can make us flourish. That's our own personal job. But in a sense, institutions, businesses, governments, NGOs, they can create the causes and conditions of happiness, of well-being and flourishing. But people have themselves to take the last mile. And then, very simply, they just take these scores that people have and they classify people by different levels of the scores. Deeply happy if you have sufficiency in 77% or more of the indicators. Extensively if it's 2/3 or more. Narrowly if it's half to 2/3. And unhappy if it's less than half. These are categories, but it gives an idea of what is possible. And the very important thing is look again at that deeply happy. You don't have to have sufficiency in everything, because we're diverse and we might not want sufficiency in some of these. We might actually feel that would be oppressive. And so we need to keep space for freedom, for self-expression, for diversity. And that's been very important in that context, in a very plural society. And when they have a measure like this, then they can compare lots of different people, men and women, farmers with corporate, people with monks and nuns, etc. They can see who's happier. So here men have a higher score than women. And community, as well as education, are the 2 areas in which men particularly score higher than women. But the interesting thing that I wanted to show you, because I think it might be relevant to your reflections this week, is what happens when you have this kind of information and you look over time. So the next GNH survey is in the field as we speak. But in the last one, they found out that there were a number of interesting improvements. Living standards went up across every single indicator significantly. So did a sense of responsibility for the environment, and wildlife damage diminished. Government services of water, sanitation, electricity increased. So did the participation in cultural festivals. The number of hours people slept increased. And the number of days that they were able to be healthy in a month increased. It's also very fascinating were the decreases. Every single psychological well-being indicator decreased statistically significantly. So did the feeling of belonging and trust in the community. These data, in a sense, create a conversation about what is going well and what is lagging, and how could we without jeopardizing what's going well, how could we improve mental health? How could we improve emotional intelligence or trust in the communities as people move around and migrate more? It brings into the eyes of leaders aspects which may later become a problem, but right now are still below the radar, so you can't usually see them. So the question for you with work on CSR for well-being is, what if we had these kind of insights for the workplaces, for the families, for the communities? Could we be better trustees of well-being, in a sense, to elaborate a phrase of Jared Hatton? Could we be better trustees of ourselves and of the planet with this kind of information? So this, in a sense, brings me to an interactive part. And I've gone a little bit quickly just to make sure we have time for this interaction. After Bhutan released its gross national happiness indicator, it sent out some personal questions in English on the English New Year, in Dzongkha on the Bhutanese New Year, so that people not only could read about an index in the newspaper, but they could apply it to themselves. And this is something that Donna Thompson did in her book, where she applied the capability approach to the 4 people in her family. And it's a very rich way of creating a discussion about meaning in an appropriate way, with respect for others' privacy, but in a way that permits us to talk about some aspects of well-being that maybe we're quite unsure exactly how to talk about. So this is the image that was sent out to all of the cell phones and the 2 main cell phone companies in that country. And a shorter version in Dzongkha was sent out later. So I'd like to now turn over to our colleagues who are going to ask some of the questions of the survey. And I just wanted to circle back before I did so to recognize that my work is primarily on poverty and trying to look at the different dimensions of poverty. But well-being is important there too, because we don't just demand bread, it's roses too. All throughout, we see both the skills and the strengths and the imagination and vision of poor people in communities, in their cooking, in their dressing, in their relationships. And we also see how when these things are jeopardized, the burden of poverty goes up greatly. And so these non-traditional dimensions are important at all levels of society. And so I really celebrate this chance to have an engagement. And now let's just reflect a little bit.
All right. That brings us to the end of, the first talk of CSR Reimagined, the week that is dedicated to well-being. And of course, very, very happy that Dr. Alkire could join, and a lot of my senior colleagues are on the call, and senior colleagues from the Tata Group. So thank you very much, and we hope that we can continue this discussion in some form or the other. This is really the beginning, but I think more needs to be done, more needs to be discussed. So thank you very much. Thank you for joining us, and have a good evening, good day, wherever you are based. Thank you very much.